Sometimes it takes just one act of courage to change everything. In Red Hollow, a woman risked her life to save a stranger, and what followed reminded a whole town what it means to stand up for what's right. Nora Blake was just a saloon worker when she stepped between a corrupt sheriff and the innocent man he meant to hang. She took a brutal beating in his place while the whole town stood frozen. The man she saved was Eli Ward, a mountain man who'd been hiding from the world. When he carried her broken body away that night, nobody knew what would happen next. But when Eli returned to town the following morning, he brought something Red Hollow had forgotten: real justice. What did one quiet mountain man do that left an entire town in tears? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Red Hollow earned its name from the rust-colored clay that stained the valley walls surrounding it. But folks who lived there long enough knew the name fit for darker reasons. The town sat in a wide basin where the Montana Territory met Wyoming, far enough from civilization that the law came slow and left fast. It was the kind of place where a man could disappear if he needed to, or where a man could make others disappear if he had the power to do it. Sheriff Marcus Kincaid had that power. He'd worn the badge for near 7 years, elected in a vote that nobody talked about anymore. Those who remembered said the ballot box had been stuffed, that half the men who voted for him were drifters who rode out the next morning with coins in their pockets. But whether the election was honest or not didn't matter much now. Kincaid had the badge, and he had 4 deputies who did whatever he told them to do. In a town of maybe 300 souls, that was all the law a man needed. The main street of Red Hollow ran straight as a rifle barrel from the livery stable at one end to the general store at the other. In between stood the saloon, the boarding house, the land office, and the sheriff's office with its 2-cell jail. Most of the businesses paid Kincaid a monthly fee for protection, though nobody could say exactly what they were being protected from except Kincaid himself. The ones who'd refused to pay had found their windows broken or their inventory spoiled. One merchant who'd been particularly stubborn had his store burned to the ground. The sheriff ruled it an accident. Nobody argued. Nora Blake worked at the Silver Dollar Saloon, the largest building on the main street. She'd been there for 3 years, ever since she and her younger brother Thomas had arrived from St. Louis with nothing but 2 carpet bags and their mother's wedding ring, which Nora had sold to pay for their first month's rent. Thomas had found work at the livery stable. Nora had taken the only job available to a woman alone, serving drinks to men who spent their days working cattle or mining claims in the hills. She was 26 years old, though the work had aged her some. Her dark hair, which she kept pinned back in a simple bun, showed a few threads of early grey at the temples. Her hands were rough from carrying trays and washing glasses in water that was never quite hot enough. But her eyes, deep brown and steady, held something that the hard years hadn't taken. She looked at people directly, without fear or judgment, and that made some men uncomfortable. The saloon's owner, a heavy-set man named Pritchard, mostly left her alone. He knew she was honest, that she never skimmed from the till or watered down the whiskey when his back was turned. She arrived when she was supposed to and worked until closing without complaint. In a place like Red Hollow, that kind of reliability was worth more than charm. Most evenings followed the same pattern. The ranch hands would come in after sundown, dusty and tired, looking to wash the day away with cheap whiskey. They'd play cards at the corner tables, arguing over hands and laughing too loud at jokes that weren't funny. Nora would move between them, refilling glasses, clearing empties, keeping her expression neutral no matter what they said or how they looked at her. She'd learned early that the job was easier if you didn't react, didn't encourage, didn't engage beyond what was necessary, but there were some men you couldn't ignore that way. Sheriff Kincaid came into the saloon most nights around 9 o'clock. He always sat at the same table near the back, where he could see both doors and keep his back to the wall. His deputies would drift in separately and take positions around the room, like wolves spreading out for a hunt. They never paid for their drinks. Pritchard had learned not to ask. Kincaid was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that might have been handsome once before violence had hardened it. He wore his gun low on his hip, and his hand never strayed far from it. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost polite, but there was something cold underneath that made people's spines straighten. Nora had learned to read his moods. Some nights he was almost jovial, buying rounds for the house and telling stories about his supposed exploits. Other nights he sat silent and brooding, his eyes following people around the room like he was making a list of grievances. Those were the dangerous nights, when men would leave earlier than usual and the saloon would empty by 10. She'd seen what happened when Kincaid decided someone had crossed him. Last summer, a cowhand named Morrison had accused one of the deputies of cheating at cards. The next morning, Morrison had been found behind the livery with 3 broken ribs and an arm bent wrong. He'd left town that same day, not even waiting for his wages. Nobody talked about it, but everybody knew. That was how things worked in Red Hollow. Everybody knew, and nobody talked. Nora kept a small room at the boarding house, 2 blocks off the main street. It wasn't much: a narrow bed, a washstand, a chair by the window where she could sit in the mornings and watch the sun come up over the eastern ridge. She kept her brother's things in a wooden box under the bed. His spare shirt, his hat, a book of poems he'd been reading the week before he died, and his pocket watch, silver-plated and engraved with their father's initials, which Thomas had carried every day since their father passed. Thomas had been 19 when he died. The sheriff had called it an accident, said the boy had been drinking and fell from the loft at the livery, broke his neck in the fall. But Nora knew her brother didn't drink, not after watching what it had done to their father. And she knew Thomas had been afraid in the days before he died. He'd told her he'd seen something he couldn't talk about, something that kept him looking over his shoulder. She'd ask questions, carefully, quietly, but nobody would talk to her. Old man Garrett, who ran the livery, had just shaken his head and told her to let it rest. Pritchard had warned her that asking questions could be dangerous. Even the town doctor, who'd examined Thomas's body, had refused to meet her eyes when he signed the death certificate. That was 8 months ago. Since then, Nora had kept her head down and her eyes open. She'd watched the sheriff and his deputies. She'd listened to their conversations when they thought she wasn't paying attention. She'd learned that Kincaid had interests beyond his official duties: cattle that moved at night without bills of sale, supplies that disappeared from warehouses and showed up in other towns, land deeds that changed hands without the proper paperwork. She'd learned that her brother had likely seen something he shouldn't have, and she'd learned that in Red Hollow, justice and law were 2 different things. And most days you couldn't find either one. The mountains rose up to the north of town, pine-covered ridges that climbed toward snow-capped peaks. Somewhere up there, people said, lived a man named Eli Ward. Nobody saw him much, maybe once or twice a year when he came down to trade furs or buy supplies. He kept to himself, didn't talk to people, didn't cause trouble. Some said he'd fought in the war. Others said he'd killed a man and was hiding from the law. A few claimed he'd gone half wild living alone up there, that he was more animal than man now. Nora had seen him exactly once, 2 years back, standing in front of the general store with a bundle of pelts over his shoulder. He was tall and lean, with a thick beard and eyes that seemed to look through things rather than at them. He'd conducted his business in silence, nodding when the storekeeper quoted prices, counting out his coins carefully. Then he'd gathered his supplies and walked back up the north road without a word to anyone. She remembered thinking he looked lonely, though she couldn't have said why. Maybe it was something in the way he held himself, like a man who'd forgotten what it was like to be around other people. Or maybe she was just seeing her own loneliness reflected back. Either way, she hadn't thought much about Eli Ward since then. He was just another story people told. Another ghost in the mountains. She didn't know yet that he was about to become the most important person in her life, or that she was about to become the same for him. She didn't know that in 3 days' time she would make a choice that would change everything, for both of them and for every person in Red Hollow. All she knew, as she wiped down tables in the empty saloon that night, was that something had to change. That a town couldn't go on like this forever, with fear ruling every decision and silence covering every crime. She just didn't know yet that she would be the one to break that silence. Outside, the autumn wind picked up, rattling the saloon's windows and carrying the smell of coming snow down from the mountains. In his cabin somewhere high in those dark pines, Eli Ward sat by his fire and wondered if this would finally be the winter he didn't wake up from. And in his office across the street, Sheriff Kincaid counted money from a strongbox that had no legal reason to be there, and planned his next move. In a game that had been going on for far too long, the pieces were in place. All that was needed now was for someone to make the first move. Tomorrow, that someone would be Nora Blake, though she didn't know it yet. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, Red Hollow slept the uneasy sleep of a town with too many secrets, and waited for the storm that was coming. The next morning came cold and grey, with clouds pressing down on the valley like a lid on a kettle. Nora woke before dawn, as she always did, washed her face in the basin by her window, and dressed in the plain brown skirt and white blouse she wore for work. She braided her hair carefully, pinned it up, and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. The same face looked back at her that always did, tired but not defeated. Not yet. She had no idea this would be the last normal morning of her life. The trouble started just after noon. Nora was sweeping the saloon's front porch when she heard the commotion down the street. Voices raised, the sound of horses, men shouting. She set the broom aside and stepped to the edge of the porch, shading her eyes against the flat grey light. Sheriff Kincaid and 3 of his deputies were dragging a man down the main street. The man's hands were bound behind his back, and even from a distance, Nora could see blood on his face. The deputies shoved him forward roughly, and when he stumbled, they yanked him back to his feet and pushed him on. People were coming out of the buildings now, drawn by the noise. The blacksmith stood in his doorway, hammer still in hand. Women peered from the windows of the boarding house. A small crowd began to gather, following at a cautious distance as Kincaid hauled his prisoner toward the center of town. Nora's heart began to beat faster. Something about the scene felt wrong, felt final. She stepped down from the porch and moved closer, joining the edge of the growing crowd. As they came nearer, she recognized the prisoner. It was Eli Ward, the mountain man. His face was swollen and bruised, his shirt torn and dirty. They must have taken him by surprise, up in the hills where he couldn't see them coming. His eyes were alert, though, scanning the crowd, taking everything in, with that same penetrating look she remembered from 2 years ago. Kincaid stopped in the middle of the street, right in front of the sheriff's office. One of his deputies threw a rope over the wooden beam that jutted from the building's front, a beam that had been used for this purpose before, though not in Nora's time in Red Hollow. The crowd murmured and shifted, but nobody stepped forward. "Folks of Red Hollow," Kincaid called out, his voice carrying down the street. "This man stands accused of cattle theft. 50 head gone missing from the Barlow Ranch last week, and tracks leading right up into the mountains where this man makes his home." Nora's breath caught. The Barlow Ranch was 10 miles south of town, and everyone knew old Barlow could barely keep track of his own name anymore, let alone his cattle. More importantly, everyone knew that Eli Ward had lived in these mountains for near a decade without causing anyone a lick of trouble. "That's a lie," someone muttered near Nora, but quietly, so quietly she barely heard it. Eli Ward said nothing. He stood straight despite his bound hands, despite the blood and bruises, and watched Kincaid with eyes that held no fear, only a kind of weary recognition, as if he'd seen this play out before in other times and places. "The penalty for cattle theft," Kincaid continued, "is hanging. And since we're a long way from a proper judge, and since the evidence is clear, I see no reason to wait." The deputy began forming a noose. Nora felt something break loose inside her chest, something that had been held down for 8 months, ever since they'd told her Thomas had died in an accident. She saw in that moment exactly what was happening, saw it with a clarity that hurt like staring into the sun. This was how Kincaid worked. This was how he'd killed her brother, how he'd killed others under the cover of law and justice while the whole town watched and did nothing. And she saw something else too. She saw that if nobody stopped this now, it would keep happening. That fear would keep winning, and good people would keep dying, and eventually there'd be nobody left in Red Hollow worth saving. Her feet were moving before she'd made a conscious decision. She pushed through the crowd, people stepping aside in surprise, as she walked forward into the open space between the crowd and the sheriff. "Stop," she said. Her voice came out stronger than she'd expected. "You can't do this." Kincaid turned to look at her. His expression was almost amused. "Miss Blake, I suggest you go back to your work. He didn't steal those cattle." Nora took another step forward. "Everyone here knows it. This isn't justice, it's murder." The crowd behind her shifted uneasily. She could feel their eyes on her back, could almost hear them thinking that she'd gone too far, said too much, sealed her own fate. "You accusing me of something?" Kincaid's voice went quiet, dangerous. "I'm saying the law is supposed to protect people, not kill innocent men." Her heart was hammering now, but she kept her voice level. "And I'm saying that everyone in this town knows you're not interested in justice. You're interested in power." For a long moment nobody moved. The wind blew dust down the empty street. Somewhere a shutter banged against a wall. Kincaid's hand drifted toward his gun, and Nora wondered if this was how she would die, shot down in the street like a dog while the whole town watched. But Kincaid didn't draw. Instead, he smiled. It was the coldest thing Nora had ever seen. "You're upset," he said almost kindly. "I understand. You lost your brother not long ago. Tragic accident. You're not thinking clearly." "My brother's death was no accident," Nora said. The words came out before she could stop them, words she'd held inside for months. "You killed him because he saw something you didn't want him to see. Just like you're killing this man because he's convenient to blame for your own crimes." The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath. Kincaid's smile disappeared. "That's quite an accusation, Miss Blake." His voice was ice now, quite serious. "The kind of thing that could get a person hurt if they can't prove it." "I can prove it," Nora said, though she couldn't, not yet, not with the evidence she had. But she was past caring about caution now. "And I will." Kincaid nodded slowly as if he'd made a decision. He looked at his deputies. "Miss Blake is clearly distraught, disturbing the peace, making false accusations against an officer of the law. I think she needs to be taught some manners." The deputies moved toward her. Nora stood her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to run. She wouldn't run. Not from this. The first blow came from behind, a deputy's fist catching her in the back. She stumbled forward, caught herself, and then they were on her. Fists and boots striking without mercy. She tried to protect her head, curling up as she went down, but they kept hitting her. Ribs, back, face. The pain was white-hot and all-consuming. Through the haze of agony, she heard Kincaid's voice. "Let this be a lesson to anyone who thinks they can question the law in this town." She tasted blood. The street's dust filled her mouth and nose. She could hear the crowd watching in silence, could feel their shame and their fear, but nobody moved to help her. Nobody dared. The beating went on. Time became meaningless, just an endless succession of impacts and pain. She thought she might die right there in the street, and part of her almost welcomed it. At least she'd said the truth before she went. At least she'd stood up. Then suddenly the beating stopped. Through her swollen eyes, Nora saw Eli Ward. He'd somehow broken free from his bonds, moved with a speed that had taken everyone by surprise. One deputy lay unconscious at his feet. The others had stepped back, hands on their guns but hesitant. Kincaid was shouting something, but Eli ignored him. He knelt beside Nora, his face close to hers. His eyes held a question, and she managed the smallest nod. "Yes." "Help me." Eli scooped her up as easily as if she weighed nothing. Blood from her face dripped onto his torn shirt. She tried to speak, to thank him, but her mouth wouldn't work properly. "Shoot him!" Kincaid's voice, high and furious, but Eli was already moving, carrying Nora toward the edge of town. The deputies raised their rifles, but Kincaid waved them down. He was smiling again, that cold smile. "Let them go," he said. "She'll be dead by morning anyway, and he'll die slow up in those mountains, knowing he killed her by dragging her body around. Sometimes nature does our work for us." The crowd parted as Eli carried Nora past them. She saw their faces through a haze of pain. Pritchard from the saloon, looking stricken. Old Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, tears on her cheeks. The blacksmith, still holding his hammer, shame written across his face. Nobody followed. Nobody helped. Eli walked through the town and out the north road, his boots crunching on the gravel, his breathing steady despite the weight he carried. Nora drifted in and out of consciousness, catching glimpses of the sky above, feeling the rhythm of his steps. She'd done it. She'd stood up. She'd told the truth. And now they were both marked for death, bound together by her courage and his unexpected mercy. But as darkness crept in at the edges of her vision, Nora felt something she hadn't felt in 8 months. Hope. Behind them, Red Hollow settled back into its usual rhythms. But something had shifted. The crowd dispersed slowly, people avoiding each other's eyes. They'd seen courage today, and they'd seen their own cowardice reflected back at them. That kind of thing leaves a mark. In his office, Kincaid cleaned the blood from his deputy's face and planned his next move. The woman would die from her injuries, and the mountain man would either freeze or starve up there trying to save her. Problem solved, but he was wrong. He was wrong about a lot of things, and by the time he realized it, it would be too late. 3 days passed before Nora could speak clearly. She'd surfaced from unconsciousness several times, fragments of awareness in a sea of pain and fever dreams. Each time, she'd seen the same face looking down at her, weathered and bearded, with eyes that held more gentleness than she would have expected from a man who lived alone in the mountains. Eli Ward, the mountain man, the stranger she'd saved, who had in turn saved her. On the morning of the 4th day, she woke to find the pain had diminished to something manageable. Her ribs still ached with every breath, and her face felt like it belonged to someone else, but the fog in her mind had lifted. She could think clearly again. The cabin was small but well made. Morning light filtered through a single window, illuminating rough-hewn furniture, a stone fireplace, shelves lined with supplies and tools. Everything had a place. Everything was clean and ordered. The home of a man who'd learned to take care of himself, who'd learned that discipline was sometimes the only thing standing between survival and surrender. Eli sat in a chair by the fire, mending something, a shirt maybe, or a hunting bag. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, the same hands that had cleaned her wounds and bound her ribs and kept her alive through 3 days of fever. "Water," she managed to say. Her voice came out as a croak. He was beside her immediately, lifting her head carefully, holding a cup to her lips. The water was cold and clean, tasting of mountain springs. She drank greedily, some of it spilling down her chin. "Slow," he said. His voice was deep, quiet, rusty from lack of use. "Too much too fast will make you sick." She nodded and forced herself to sip. When she'd had enough, he lowered her head back to the pillow and returned to his chair. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Thank you," Nora finally said, "for saving me, for taking care of me." Eli shook his head slightly. "You saved me first. This just makes us even. I don't think it works that way. Maybe not." He went back to his mending. "You should rest more. You're not healed yet." But Nora didn't want to rest. She'd spent 3 days unconscious, and now that her mind was clear, the urgency of everything came flooding back. Kincaid, her brother. "The truth that needed to be told. They'll come for us," she said. "Maybe, maybe not. Storm blew through the day after I brought you here. Covered our tracks, snowed us in pretty good. They'd have a hard time finding this place even if they knew where to look. They'll try, though. Kincaid doesn't let things go." Eli was quiet for a moment, his hands still working the needle and thread. "Tell me about your brother," he said finally. "What happened to him?" So she told him. Told him about Thomas, about how close they'd been after their parents died, about coming to Red Hollow looking for a fresh start, about the jobs they'd found and the life they'd begun to build, about how Thomas had worked at the livery stable, how he'd been quiet and honest and good with horses, and then she told him about the cattle. Thomas worked late sometimes, Nora said, helping Mr. Garrett close up. One night, about 9 months ago, he saw something he wasn't supposed to see. Kincaid and his deputies, moving cattle through town in the middle of the night. 50 head or more, Thomas said, with no drover and no papers. They were headed toward the pass that leads into Wyoming territory. Eli's hands stopped moving. Stolen cattle! That's what Thomas thought. He didn't say anything to anyone except me at first. He was scared, wanted to think about what to do. But someone must have seen him that night, must have told Kincaid. Because 3 days later, they found Thomas dead in the livery loft. The sheriff said it was an accident, broken neck from a fall. That's what they claimed. But Thomas wasn't drinking, and he knew that loft like the back of his hand. He'd climbed up and down 100 times without incident. Nora's voice cracked, and she had to stop, take a breath. He was murdered, I know it, and I think he knew it was coming. He was terrified those last few days. Eli set down his mending and looked at her directly. Did he leave any proof? Any evidence of what he saw? Nora nodded, wincing at the pain the movement caused. He kept a journal. Not regular diary entries, just notes about things he saw, things that didn't sit right. He showed it to me once, told me if anything happened to him, I should find it and show it to someone who could help. Where is it? Hidden in my room at the boarding house, under a loose floorboard beneath my bed. I've read through it several times. It's not just the cattle. Thomas documented months of suspicious activity. Supplies disappearing from warehouses, and deeds changing hands under suspicious circumstances. People leaving town suddenly. People who'd crossed Kincaid. Eli was quiet for a long moment, thinking. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, measured. That's dangerous evidence to have. If Kincaid knows you have it, he doesn't. At least I don't think he does. I've been careful. Never talked about it, never let on that I was investigating. But when I saw him about to hang you yesterday, She stopped, the memory of it flooding back. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I couldn't watch it happen again. You called him out in front of the whole town. I told the truth. The truth gets people killed in places like Red Hollow. Yes, Nora said softly. It does, but so does silence. Thomas stayed silent for 3 days, and it didn't save him. At least I went down fighting. Eli leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes serious. You're not going down. Not if I have anything to say about it. Why? Nora asked. Why do you care? You don't know me. You could have let them hang you and been done with all this. Maybe I'm tired of letting things happen. Eli's voice was rough with emotion he was trying to hold back. Maybe I spent too many years hiding up here, telling myself it was better not to get involved, better not to care. And maybe seeing you stand up to them reminded me that some things are worth fighting for. Even when the fight seems hopeless, they looked at each other across the small cabin. 2 damaged people who'd found themselves bound together by courage and circumstance. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside the fire crackled warm and steady. There's something else, Nora said quietly. Something Thomas wrote in his journal near the end. He said he'd received a letter from someone, a deputy U.S. Marshal, I think. Someone who was investigating corruption in the territory. Thomas never said what was in the letter, but he'd hidden it with his journal. Eli sat up straighter. A federal marshal. That's what I gathered. I haven't been able to get back to my room to retrieve the journal since Thomas died. It's been too dangerous. But if that letter is real, if there was a marshal investigating Kincaid, then this is bigger than just one corrupt sheriff in a backwater town. That's what I think. That's what scared Thomas so much. He wasn't just dealing with local criminals. He'd stumbled into something much larger. The implications hung between them, heavy and dangerous. If Nora was right, if Thomas had evidence of a wider conspiracy, then they weren't just fighting for justice in Red Hollow. They were taking on something that stretched across the territory, something with resources and reach far beyond what they'd imagined. We need that journal, Eli said finally. We do. But getting it means going back to town. And if we go back, they'll kill us on sight, Nora nodded. So we have a choice. We can stay here, stay hidden, and live with the knowledge that my brother's murderers go free, that Kincaid keeps running Red Hollow like his personal kingdom, that other people will suffer and die because we chose safety over justice. Or, Eli asked, though he already knew the answer, or we go back. We get the evidence, and we make sure the truth comes out, no matter what it costs. Eli looked at her, This woman who'd been beaten nearly to death, who was still too weak to stand on her own, who was proposing they walk back into the place that had almost killed them both. He saw no fear in her eyes, only determination and a kind of fierce hope that maybe, just maybe, courage could still win. "All right," he said. "But not yet. You need to heal first. We need to plan, and we need to understand exactly what we're up against before we make our move." Nora smiled, despite the pain it caused her swollen face. "Thank you, Eli." He nodded, stood, and returned to his chair by the fire. Outside, snow continued to fall, sealing them into their mountain sanctuary. They had time now, time to heal and prepare. Time to figure out how two people with nothing but the truth could take on an empire of lies. It wouldn't be easy. It might not even be possible. But for the first time in years, both of them had something worth fighting for. And sometimes that was enough. 3 weeks after Eli had carried her from Red Hollow, Nora woke to find something on the chair beside her bed. It took her a moment to recognize what she was looking at, a small wooden box, no bigger than her palm, carved with intricate patterns of leaves and birds. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each detail precise and delicate. She picked it up carefully, turning it in the morning light. The wood was warm and smooth, polished to a soft sheen. When she opened it, she found it lined with soft leather. It was clearly meant to hold something precious, something small enough to carry, but important enough to protect. "For your brother's watch," Eli said from his place by the fire. "Figured it deserved better than a wooden box under a bed." Nora felt tears prick her eyes. She told him about Thomas's pocket watch, how it was the last thing of their father's they had, how Thomas had carried it every day. She hadn't expected Eli to remember, much less to make something so beautiful for it. "You made this?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "Had to do something with my evenings. Used to make things for Emma and James, birds mostly, little animals. Haven't carved anything in years, but the hands still remember." She looked at him across the small cabin. This man who'd saved her life and tended her wounds, and spent his evenings carving a box for a watch he'd never seen, to honor a brother he'd never met. Her throat tightened with emotion she couldn't quite name. "It's beautiful," she said. "Thank you." He nodded, uncomfortable with the gratitude, and went back to tending the fire. But she saw the way his shoulders relaxed, the small satisfaction of having made something that mattered to someone. Later that day, after she'd insisted she was strong enough, they went outside. Nora's first time leaving the cabin since Eli had carried her inside. The cold bit at her face, but the air was clean and sharp and tasted like freedom. Snow lay heavy on the ground, pristine and unmarked, except for the paths Eli had worn between the cabin and his woodpile, between the cabin and the spring. "Can you walk?" he asked. Only one way to find out. She made it 20 steps before her legs started shaking. Eli was there immediately, his arm around her waist, supporting her weight. She leaned into him, frustrated by her weakness, but grateful for his strength. "It'll come back," he said. "Another week or two and you'll be running these hills. I've never run anywhere in my life. Then you'll walk them strongly." "That's good enough." They stood that way for a while, her leaning against him, both of them looking out at the mountains. The world up here was so different from Red Hollow, clean and quiet and untouched by human cruelty. She could understand why Eli had chosen this place to hide, why he'd thought isolation was the answer, but isolation wasn't the answer. Not really. She understood that now, and she thought maybe he was beginning to understand it too. People needed people, even when it hurt, even when it led to loss. The alternative was to stop being fully human, to become like the mountains themselves, enduring but empty of warmth. "Tell me about your medal," she said quietly. "The one I found in your trunk." Eli stiffened slightly. She'd discovered it by accident a few days earlier, when he'd asked her to fetch a spare blanket. The Medal of Honor, tucked away in a box with his old uniform, hidden like a shameful secret rather than displayed with pride. "It doesn't matter," he said. "It matters to me." He was quiet for a long time, and she thought he might not answer. But finally he spoke. "There was a field hospital about 30 miles from Shiloh. Confederate raiders came through, trying to destroy our supplies. Most of the soldiers who could fight were at the front lines. It was just me and a few orderlies and about 50 wounded men who couldn't move. He paused, and she waited, not pushing. I held them off for 2 hours until reinforcements arrived. Killed 3 men, wounded 4 others. Saved the hospital and everyone in it. They gave me the medal, said I was a hero. His voice turned bitter, but I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a killer who happened to be killing the right people at the right time. You saved lives, Nora said, by taking lives. The math doesn't add up the way they want you to think it does. Every man I killed, he was somebody's son, maybe somebody's father or brother. Their families grieved, just like mine grieved when Sarah and the children died. Heroism is just violence that serves a purpose people agree with. Nora understood what he was saying, but she also understood something he didn't seem to see. You're right that violence creates grief, no matter who commits it or why, but there's a difference between violence that protects and violence that oppresses. Between killing in defense of the helpless and killing to maintain power over others. You protected people who couldn't protect themselves. That's not the same as what Kincaid does. Eli looked at her, something shifting in his expression. You really believe that? I do, I have to. Because if I don't believe that standing up to evil matters, that fighting for justice is different from fighting for power, then Thomas died for nothing. And I can't accept that. He nodded slowly, and she saw him wrestling with something inside himself, some decision he'd been avoiding. When he spoke again, his voice was different, stronger, more certain. When we go back to Red Hollow, things are going to get violent. Kincaid won't let us take that evidence without a fight. People might die. I might have to... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. I know, Nora said. And I'm not asking you to become that man again, the soldier, the killer. But I am asking you to be the protector, the one who stands between evil and the people it wants to hurt. Like you did at that field hospital. Like you did when you carried me out of Red Hollow. You're asking a lot. I'm asking you to be who you already are. You just forgot for a while. They stood together in the snow, the mountains rising around them like cathedral walls. Somewhere down below, Red Hollow went about its business, unaware that 2 people were preparing to upend everything, unaware that justice was coming, carried by a woman who wouldn't stay silent and a man who'd remembered what he was fighting for. 1 more week, Eli said, to make sure you're fully healed, to gather what we need. Then we go. 1 more week, Nora agreed. They turned and walked back to the cabin together, moving slowly, Eli still supporting her weight. But she was stronger now than she'd been yesterday, and she'd be stronger still tomorrow. By the time they went back down that mountain, she'd be ready. That night, as they sat by the fire, Eli opened the trunk again and took out the medal. He looked at it for a long moment, then set it on the mantel where he could see it. Not displayed with pride exactly, but no longer hidden in shame either. Just there, a reminder of who he'd been and who he might become again. Nora watched him do it and said nothing. Some moments didn't need words. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside the cabin, 2 people sat in comfortable silence and prepared their hearts for what was coming. They'd made their choice. They'd committed to a course that might end in death, but would at least end with the truth spoken and evil opposed. And really, what more could anyone ask of a life than that? The fire crackled and sparked. The cabin held its warmth against the cold, and 2 people who'd been broken found in each other the strength to face what had broken them. 1 more week, and then everything would change. 1 more week. And then Red Hollow would learn what it meant to stand against injustice. 1 more week. And then Nora and Eli would either win their fight or die trying. But either way, they'd go down together. And somehow, that made all the difference. The week passed like water through fingers, too fast and impossible to hold. On the 7th day, with Nora strong enough to ride and the weather holding clear, they made their final preparations. Eli packed supplies, rope, knives, matches, dried meat and hardtack in case they needed to run and couldn't come back. Nora checked and rechecked the crude map they'd drawn, memorizing the layout of Red Hollow, visualizing every step of their plan. They left the cabin just after sunset, when the light was fading, but darkness hadn't fully claimed the valley. Eli moved through the forest like smoke, making no sound, leaving almost no trace. Nora followed as best she could, grateful for the weeks he'd spent teaching her how to move quietly, how to place her feet to avoid snapping twigs or rustling undergrowth. The descent took 3 hours. They reached the outskirts of Red Hollow well after midnight, when the town was dark and still. A few windows showed lamplight. The saloon, where late card games would be running, and the sheriff's office, where someone always kept watch. But most of the buildings were dark, their occupants asleep or trying to be. They moved through the shadows behind the buildings, avoiding the main street. Dogs barked in the distance, but not nearby. The cold had driven most animals indoors. Eli led them to the church first, as planned. The small stable behind it held 2 horses, exactly as Nora had promised. Good animals, calm and well-fed. Eli spoke to them in whispers, his hand on their necks, settling them. He prepared their saddles, but left them tied, ready for a quick departure. Then they moved toward the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson, the owner, kept the back door locked, but not barred. Nora had a key. She'd paid for that privilege when she'd first rented her room. The door opened silently, well-oiled hinges making no sound. They stepped inside, Eli closing the door carefully behind them. The boarding house smelled of old wood and cooking grease, and the faint lavender water Mrs. Henderson used to clean the floors. Nora's room was on the 2nd floor, 3rd door on the left. They climbed the stairs, testing each step before putting their weight on it, avoiding the boards that creaked. Her room was exactly as she'd left it 4 weeks ago. The narrow bed, the washstand, the single chair by the window. Everything untouched, waiting for her return that nobody expected. She knelt beside the bed and ran her fingers along the floorboards until she found the loose one. It came up easily, revealing the hollow space beneath. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were Thomas's journal and a sealed envelope. She'd expected to feel triumph or relief or vindication. Instead, she felt only a deep sadness. This was all that remained of her brother. These pages, these words, this evidence of crimes that had cost him his life. She pulled them out carefully and unwrapped them. The journal was exactly as she remembered. Thomas's careful handwriting, dates and observations, a catalogue of corruption. She handed it to Eli, who held it reverently, understanding its weight. But the envelope was something she'd never opened. She'd been too afraid before, too worried that reading it might put her in more danger. Now, with Eli beside her and their course already set, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. It was dated 10 months ago, 2 weeks before Thomas died. She read it by the light coming through the window, and with each line, her understanding of everything shifted. The letter was from Deputy U.S. Marshal William Crawford. He'd been investigating reports of organized crime in the Montana and Wyoming territories, specifically a network of corrupt officials involved in cattle theft, land fraud, and murder. His investigation had led him to Red Hollow and Sheriff Marcus Kincaid, but it was worse than Nora had imagined. Much worse. Kincaid wasn't the leader of this operation. He was just one small part of a network that stretched across 3 territories, involving sheriffs, land agents, cattle buyers, and territorial officials. They moved stolen cattle across state lines, falsified land titles, eliminated witnesses, and split the profits among themselves. The operation had been running for at least 5 years and had generated thousands of dollars in illegal revenue. Marshal Crawford had been gathering evidence, building a case that would bring down the entire network. He'd contacted Thomas because he'd heard that the young man had witnessed something important, something that could help make the case airtight, but Crawford had never made his arrest. According to the letter, he'd been planning to come to Red Hollow within the week to take Kincaid into custody and secure Thomas's testimony. He'd never arrived. Nora's hands shook as she read the final paragraph. If you're reading this, Mr. Blake, and I have not arrived as promised, assume the worst. I've left copies of my evidence with my superior, Judge Harrison Mitchell, in Helena. He can be trusted. Take this letter to him, along with whatever you've observed. Don't trust the local law. Don't trust anyone in Red Hollow. This conspiracy reaches higher than you know. The letter was signed with a flourish, and beneath the signature was a notation: Departed Billings, Montana, October 15th. Expected arrival, Red Hollow. October 17th. Thomas had died on October 19th. Nora looked up at Eli, her face pale in the moonlight. They killed the marshal. That's why he never came. They killed him, and then they killed Thomas, and they made both deaths look like accidents. Eli took the letter from her, read it quickly, his expression darkening. This is bigger than we thought. If this network is as extensive as Crawford claimed, we're not just fighting Kincaid. We're fighting everyone connected to him. Territorial officials, law enforcement, people with real power, which means the evidence is more important than ever. Nora's voice was steady, despite the fear coursing through her. We need to get this to Helena, to Judge Mitchell. It's the only way to bring them all down. Eli nodded, folding the letter and tucking it inside his coat along with the journal. Helena is 200 miles north. 4 days hard riding in good weather, longer in snow. And they'll be hunting us the moment they realize we're back. Then, we'd better not let them realize it until we're long gone. They were turning to leave when they heard the footsteps, heavy boots on the stairs, multiple sets moving fast. Someone had seen them or heard them, or somehow known they'd come. Eli moved to the door, his hand on his knife, but the footsteps were already too close. The door burst open. 2 of Kincaid's deputies filled the doorway, guns drawn. Behind them, more men crowded the hallway. Well, well, said the first deputy, a man named Carson with a scarred face and mean eyes. The dead woman and the ghost from the mountain. Sheriff said you'd come back eventually. Said people like you can't help yourselves. Eli's hand tightened on his knife, but Nora touched his arm. 6 men with guns in a narrow hallway. They'd be dead before they took 2 steps. Easy now, Carson said, seeing the calculation in Eli's eyes. We got orders to bring you in alive if possible. But if you make trouble, the sheriff won't mind cleaning up bodies. They were herded downstairs at gunpoint out into the street. Nora's mind raced. They'd been so careful, so quiet. How had Kincaid known? As if reading her thoughts, Carson laughed. You think we're fools? Sheriffs had men watching this place every night since you disappeared. Figured sooner or later you'd come for whatever your brother left behind. Just had to wait you out. They'd walked into a trap. All their planning, all their preparation, and they'd done exactly what Kincaid expected them to do. The deputies marched them toward the sheriff's office. Lights were coming on in windows now, people waking to see what the commotion was about. By the time they reached the office, a small crowd had gathered. The same townspeople who'd watched Nora get beaten, who'd stayed silent when injustice paraded in front of them. Kincaid was waiting in his office, sitting behind his desk, like a king on a throne. He smiled when they were brought in, a smile that made Nora's skin crawl. Miss Blake, Mr. Ward, so good of you to return. I was beginning to think you'd frozen to death up there. He gestured to his deputies. Search them. The deputies were thorough and rough. They found Eli's weapons, knife, the small pistol he'd tucked in his belt, and they found the journal and the letter tucked inside Eli's coat. Kincaid opened the journal, flipped through it casually. His expression never changed, but Nora saw his knuckles whiten as he gripped the pages. Then he opened the letter. Read it slowly. His jaw tightened. When he looked up, his eyes were cold as winter stone. So you found Crawford's letter. I wondered where it had gone. Your brother hid it well. He tossed the papers onto his desk. Did you really think this would save you? That some federal marshal's paranoid ramblings would make a difference? He knew, Nora said. He knew about all of it. The cattle theft, the network, everything. And he told his superior. Even if you kill us, the truth is already out there. Kincaid laughed. Judge Mitchell. He's part of it, you stupid girl. How do you think Crawford died? Who do you think sent word ahead that he was coming? He stood, walked around the desk. The judge, 3 territorial senators, a dozen sheriffs and deputies, land agents in 4 towns, cattle buyers across 2 territories. This isn't some small-time operation. This is how things work out here. This is the law. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Judge Mitchell, the man Crawford had trusted, the man they'd been planning to ride to, was part of the conspiracy. There was no one to report to, no higher authority to appeal to. The corruption went all the way up, so what now? Eli asked quietly. You kill us like you killed Crawford and Thomas. Eventually, Kincaid said. But first, you're going to tell me if anyone else knows about this. If you made copies, if you told anyone, if there's any other loose end I need to tie up. We told everyone, Nora lied. The whole town knows. Kincaid slapped her hard enough to snap her head to the side. She tasted blood again, a familiar flavor. Don't lie to me. You're not that stupid. You came here in secret at night because you knew you had to be careful. Now tell me the truth, or I'll start breaking bones until you do. Eli surged forward, but the deputies grabbed him, forced him to his knees. A gun pressed against the back of his head. Last chance, Kincaid said. Nora looked at him, this man who'd killed her brother and so many others, and she felt something settle inside her. They'd failed. The evidence they'd risked everything for was in enemy hands. The people they'd counted on for help were part of the problem. There was no way out, no cavalry coming to save them, but she'd be damned if she'd give him anything more. Go to hell, she said clearly. Kincaid nodded, as if he'd expected nothing less. Put them in the cells. Tomorrow morning we'll take them out to the canyon and dispose of them properly. Make it look like they died trying to escape, killed each other in a struggle or something. Whatever seems believable. The deputies hauled them toward the back of the office, toward the 2 cells that had held other people who'd crossed Kincaid. Nora looked back once and saw the sheriff feeding Thomas's journal and Crawford's letter into the stove, burning the only evidence that could have brought him down. The cell door clanged shut. The deputies left, taking the lamps with them. Darkness swallowed everything. Eli found her hand in the dark, squeezed it. I'm sorry, he said. I should have been more careful, should have realized it was a trap. We both should have, Nora said, but it doesn't matter now. We're not dead yet. We will be by morning. They sat in the darkness, backs against the cold stone wall, and tried to think of a way out that didn't exist. Outside, Red Hollow slept, unaware or uncaring that justice had been so close and then burned to ashes. Unaware that by morning 2 people who'd tried to stand up for what was right would be dead in some canyon, their bodies left for the scavengers. Somewhere in the night, a clock struck 3. Morning was coming fast, and with it, the end of everything. The hours before dawn were the longest of Nora's life. She and Eli sat in that cell, whispering plans that had no chance of working, trying to find hope where none existed. The cells were solid, stone walls, iron bars, a heavy lock that had no weakness they could exploit. They had no weapons, no tools, no way to signal for help even if anyone would come, and yet Eli kept working. He felt along every inch of the cell walls, searching for loose stones. He tested the bars, looking for rust or weak points. He examined the lock mechanism. Though without tools, there was nothing he could do with it. He refused to accept that this was the end, refused to stop fighting until the last possible moment. Nora watched him and felt a swell of emotion so strong it threatened to choke her. This man, who'd lost everything, who'd spent years hiding from life, was fighting with everything he had to save them both. For her, because she'd stood up for him in a street 4 weeks ago, and that had changed something fundamental in who he was. Eli, she said softly, if we don't make it, we will, he said, not looking at her, still examining the lock. But if we don't, I want you to know that these past weeks, they've meant something to me. You've meant something to me. He stopped then, turned to look at her. In the faint light coming through the cell's high window, she could see his face, strong and weathered and full of a pain he'd carried for too long. You gave me back my life, he said quietly. I didn't want it, didn't think I deserved it, but you gave it back anyway. And whatever happens at sunrise, I'm grateful for that. They moved closer together, and she rested her head on his shoulder. His arm came around her, and they sat that way, drawing comfort from each other's presence. Outside, the first birds began their morning songs. Dawn was coming. Then they heard voices, not from the sheriff's office, but from outside in the street. Raised voices, multiple people, a sound like a crowd gathering. Eli stood and moved to the small window high in the cell wall. He had to stand on the bench to see out, and even then he could only see a limited view of the street. "There are people out there," he said. "A lot of people. It's not even sunrise yet. But they're gathering. Maybe they're coming to watch us die," Nora said bitterly. But as the voices grew louder, she began to recognize them. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, Pritchard from the saloon, old Garrett from the livery stable, the blacksmith, the doctor. Voices she'd heard every day for 3 years, voices of people who'd stayed silent when she'd been beaten. "Something's happening," Eli said. The door to the cell area opened. A deputy came through, looking nervous. He was young, maybe 22, a kid named Miller, who'd only been wearing the badge for a few months. He looked at them through the bars, his hand on his gun but not drawing it. "There's a crowd outside," he said. "They're asking to see you, both of you. Sheriff says no, but they're not leaving." "What do they want?" Nora asked. "I don't know. They just keep saying they need to talk to you, that they need to hear the truth." He looked over his shoulder nervously. "Sheriff's getting angry. He's talking about dispersing them by force." Before anyone could respond, they heard Kincaid's voice, loud and commanding. "Go home. This is official law business. Anyone who doesn't disperse will be arrested for obstruction." But the crowd didn't disperse. Instead, they got louder. "We want to see them," someone shouted. It sounded like the blacksmith. "We have a right to know what's happening." Another voice. "Mrs. Henderson, you murdered Tom Blake, and you're going to murder these two the same way." That was Pritchard, his voice cracking with emotion. "We're not blind. We're not fools. We know what you are." More voices joined in, a chorus of accusation and demand. The town that had been silent for so long was finding its voice, and it was angry. Miller looked torn, glancing between the cells and the door that led to the office. I need to—" He trailed off, not sure what he should do. "You should let us out," Eli said calmly, "before this gets worse, before people start dying for no reason." "I can't do that. Sheriff would—" "The sheriff is going to kill us in a few hours anyway," Nora said. "You know that's what's planned. Probably already dug our graves out in the canyon. Are you comfortable with that? With murdering people in cold blood?" Miller's face was pale. "I didn't sign up for murder. I thought being a deputy meant keeping people safe." "It should mean that," Eli said. "It could mean that, but not under Kincaid. You know what he is. You've seen what he does." The noise from outside was getting louder. They heard the sound of breaking glass. Someone had thrown something through a window. Kincaid was shouting, his deputies yelling back at the crowd. The situation was escalating fast. Miller made a decision. He pulled out his keys, hands shaking, and unlocked the cell door. "I can't be part of this anymore. I can't—" He opened the door, stepped back. "There's a back way out of the building, through the storage room. It leads to the alley behind the gunsmith's shop." "Why are you doing this?" Nora asked. "Because your brother was my friend," Miller said, tears in his eyes. "We worked together sometimes, moved supplies. He was a good man, and I knew something was wrong when they said he died in an accident, but I was too scared to say anything, too scared to stand up." He looked at them with desperate hope. "But maybe I can still do something right. Maybe it's not too late for that." Eli gripped the young man's shoulder. "Thank you. This took courage." "Go," Miller said, "before he realizes what I've done. And tell people, all right? Tell people the truth about all of it." They moved quickly through the back rooms of the sheriff's office. Behind them, they could hear the confrontation escalating. Kincaid ordering his deputies to fire into the crowd, deputies refusing or hesitating, people shouting about justice and murder, and enough being enough. The storage room door opened onto a narrow alley. The sun was just starting to crest the eastern ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. They ran, staying low, moving through the alleys and back passages that Eli had scouted during their planning. The horses were still at the church, thank God, still saddled and ready, just as they'd left them. Eli untied them quickly and helped Nora mount. Her ribs protested the movement, but adrenaline pushed the pain aside. They were about to ride when they heard footsteps. Eli spun, ready to fight. But it was Pritchard, the saloon owner, running toward them with something in his hands. "Wait," he gasped, out of breath. "Take this." He held out a leather satchel. "It's copies, Tom's journal. I made copies before when he first started documenting things. He asked me to keep them safe. I didn't know what to do with them after he died, but here, take them." Nora took the satchel, her hands shaking. "You had copies all this time." "I'm sorry," Pritchard said, shame written across his face. "I should have done something sooner, should have stood up like you did. But I was scared. We all were. But this morning, when we heard you'd been arrested, when we realized Kincaid was going to kill you," he stopped, swallowed hard. "Some of us stayed up all night talking, realized we couldn't let it happen again. Couldn't let more good people die while we watched." "The crowd," Eli said. "You organized them. Me and about 20 others. We're tired of being afraid, tired of letting evil win because we're too cowardly to fight it." He looked at Nora with tears in his eyes. Tom was a good kid. He deserved better than what happened to him. "So do you." From the direction of the sheriff's office they heard gunfire, a single shot, then shouting, then more shots. The confrontation had turned violent. "You need to go," Pritchard said. "Get those copies somewhere safe. There's a newspaper editor in Billings, man named Harrison. He's honest, publishes the truth even when it's dangerous. Get the journal to him." "What about Helena?" "Judge Mitchell?" Nora asked. "Mitchell's in Kincaid's pocket. Has been for years. Harrison's your best bet. He's been trying to expose corruption in the territory for years, but never had enough evidence. This will give him everything he needs. More gunfire, closer now." They were running out of time. "Thank you," Nora said to Pritchard. "Thank you for finally standing up. I should have done it sooner. But maybe it's not too late to make things right." He stepped back, gestured toward the north road. "Go, and don't come back until it's safe. We'll handle things here." Eli kicked his horse into motion, and Nora followed. They galloped through the awakening town, past buildings where people were emerging to see what the commotion was about, past the edge of town and onto the north road that would take them away from Red Hollow. Behind them, the sound of fighting continued. The town had finally found its courage, was finally standing up to the tyranny that had ruled it for so long. People were going to get hurt, maybe killed, but they were fighting for something that mattered, fighting for the right to live without fear. As they rode, Nora clutched the satchel to her chest. Thomas's words, his careful documentation of crimes and corruption, would not be lost. The truth would come out. Justice would be served, even if it took time, even if the cost was high. They rode hard for an hour before Eli finally slowed the horses, checking behind them for pursuit. The road was empty. Either Kincaid was too busy dealing with the uprising to send men after them, or he didn't realize yet that they'd escaped. "Billings is 3 days northeast," Eli said. "We'll need to avoid the main roads, keep to the high country where we can see anyone coming." Nora nodded. 3 days. 3 days to stay alive, to reach safety, to deliver the evidence that could bring down an entire network of corruption. 3 days to make Thomas's death mean something. They urged the horses forward, into the rising sun, into whatever future waited for them. Behind them, Red Hollow burned with the fire of people who'd finally remembered that courage was contagious, that standing up to evil was possible, that silence was its own kind of sin, and somewhere in that chaos, in that uprising of ordinary people who'd found extraordinary courage, was the seed of real change. The kind of change that started with one person standing up and spread until it became a movement that couldn't be stopped. Nora had started it, Eli had sustained it, and now the town itself was carrying it forward. They rode toward Billings, toward hope, toward justice. And for the first time in a long time, both of them believed they might actually make it, The silence after the gunshots was absolute. Then Kincaid's remaining deputies dropped their weapons and raised their hands, the fight gone out of them. Without their leader, without the certainty that power and fear could protect them, they were just scared men facing consequences they'd avoided for too long. Eli and Nora emerged from the canyon slowly, weapons still ready, not quite believing it was over. The citizens of Red Hollow swarmed forward, surrounding the deputies, disarming them, binding their hands with rope. There was no mercy in their faces, but no excessive violence either. They'd come for justice, not revenge. Pritchard dismounted and walked toward Eli and Nora. His face was drawn, aged by the day's events. Behind him, other familiar faces, the blacksmith, old Garrett from the livery, Mrs. Henderson, the doctor, even Reverend Michaels from the church. People who'd been silent for years had found their voices and their courage. "Is it done?" Pritchard asked, looking at Kincaid's body. "It's done," Eli said quietly. Pritchard nodded, then looked at Nora. "I'm sorry we didn't stand with you sooner. Sorry it took us so long to find our courage. Tom deserved better. So did you. You're here now," Nora said, her voice tight with emotion. "That's what matters." The doctor was already examining Kincaid, confirming what everyone knew. Dead before he hit the ground, 3 bullets finding their mark almost simultaneously. No one would ever know which shot had been the fatal one, and perhaps that was fitting. The entire community had brought him down, not just one person. Deputy Miller approached, looking years older than the young man who'd unlocked their cell that morning. "We found something in the sheriff's office after you left. A ledger hidden in a false bottom of his desk. It has names, dates, amounts of money, everyone involved in the operation, everything they did. It's more evidence than we could have hoped for. Take it to Billings with the journal copies," Eli said. "Make sure Harrison gets everything. Make it impossible for them to cover this up." "We will," Miller said. "And we'll testify, all of us. Tell the truth about what happened here, about what we let happen." He looked at the bound deputies, his former colleagues. "Some of us were complicit by action, some by silence, but we're all responsible." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, carrying canteens and food wrapped in cloth. "You'll need provisions for the ride to Billings. It's 3 days from here, and you've both been through enough." Nora took the offerings gratefully. "Thank you. For everything. For coming after us. For finally standing up. You showed us how," Mrs. Henderson said simply. "Sometimes all it takes is one person to stand up first. You were that person for us." They spent an hour there in the shadow of the canyon, making plans. Pritchard and 10 men would escort the deputies back to Red Hollow and hold them until legitimate law enforcement could arrive. Miller would ride with Eli and Nora to Billings, carrying the ledger and additional testimony. The rest would return to town and begin the work of rebuilding what corruption had destroyed. "What about the others?" Nora asked. "The territorial officials, the judges, all the people higher up the chain." "One fight at a time," Pritchard said. "We expose what we can, tell the truth as we know it, and trust that honest people will do the right thing when they have the facts. It won't be quick, and it won't be easy, but it started. You started it. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, they said their goodbyes. Eli shook hands with men who'd once been strangers, accepting their thanks and their apologies. Nora embraced Mrs. Henderson and wept, releasing emotions she'd held tight for weeks. Then the group split. Pritchard's party headed south with their prisoners. Eli, Nora, and Miller turned northeast toward Billings and the reckoning that waited there. They rode through the night, putting distance between themselves and Red Hollow, though the danger now came from a different direction. If the territorial officials learned what was happening, they might send men to intercept them. Speed and secrecy were their best weapons now. Miller proved to be good company despite the circumstances. He talked as they rode, telling them about growing up in Red Hollow, about watching the town change under Kincaid's rule, about the slow erosion of decency that happened when good people stayed silent. "I thought wearing the badge would mean protecting people," he said. "But instead I became part of what they needed protection from. I'll carry that shame for the rest of my life." "You helped us escape," Nora said. You rode with the citizens against your fellow deputies. You chose right in the end. Choosing right at the end doesn't erase choosing wrong at the beginning. But maybe I can spend the rest of my life trying to balance the scales, trying to be the kind of lawman I should have been from the start. They rode on, through country that grew more settled as they approached Billings. They passed farms and ranches, saw lights in windows that spoke of families gathered for evening meals, of ordinary lives lived in ordinary ways. It reminded them what they were fighting for, not just justice for the dead, but safety for the living, the right to exist without fear, the chance to build lives that weren't shadowed by corruption and violence. On the morning of the third day, they crested a rise and saw Billings spread out in the valley below. It was larger than Red Hollow, a real town with a newspaper office and a telegraph station, and connections to the wider world. A place where the truth could be amplified, where a single story of corruption could spark investigations across the territory. They rode down into town as the sun climbed toward noon. People stopped to stare at them. 2 dusty travelers and a deputy with a haunted look, all of them carrying the weight of something important. They rode straight to the newspaper office, a modest building with the Billings Gazette painted across the front window. Inside, they found Samuel Harrison, the editor Pritchard had told them about. He was a middle-aged man with ink-stained fingers and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He listened as they told their story, as Miller laid out the ledger and Nora produced the copies of Thomas's journal. He read through the documents with growing intensity, occasionally making notes, asking clarifying questions. When they finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at them with something like awe. "This is the biggest story to come out of the territories in a decade," he said quietly. "Maybe longer. If even half of what's documented here is true, it'll bring down dozens of corrupt officials, change how law enforcement works out here, maybe even lead to federal oversight." "Can you publish it?" Eli asked. "I can, I will. But you need to understand. The moment this goes to press, you'll have powerful enemies, people who'll want to silence you, discredit you, maybe worse. Are you prepared for that?" Eli looked at Nora. She looked back at him. They'd already survived the worst, already faced death and kept going. What was a little more danger compared to the possibility of real change? "We're prepared," Nora said firmly. Harrison nodded, a smile breaking across his weathered face. "Then let's burn this whole corrupt system to the ground and build something better in its place. Let's show them what happens when ordinary people refuse to be afraid anymore." He stood and shook their hands, and in that moment Nora felt something shift. This was no longer just about her brother, or about Red Hollow, or even about Eli and herself. This was about every person who'd ever been victimized by corrupt power, every voice that had been silenced, every truth that had been buried. This was about justice, real justice, the kind that couldn't be bought or intimidated or covered up, and it was just beginning. The Billings Gazette published the story 3 days later. Front page, above the fold, with the headline, "Corruption Network Exposed. Territorial Officials Implicated in Murder, Theft, Fraud." Samuel Harrison had been thorough, cross-referencing every claim in Thomas's journal with the ledger from Kincaid's office, building a case so airtight that no one could dismiss it as rumor or exaggeration. The story spread like wildfire. Other newspapers picked it up. Telegraph wires carried it to Helena, to Cheyenne, to Denver. Federal marshals, real ones untainted by the conspiracy, arrived within a week to begin arrests. Judge Mitchell, confronted with overwhelming evidence, resigned and fled the territory. 3 senators were removed from office. Sheriffs and deputies across Montana and Wyoming found themselves under investigation. Their networks crumbling as people who'd been too afraid to speak finally found the courage to testify. It took 2 months for the initial wave of justice to roll through, and longer still for all the trials and hearings to conclude. But when the dust settled, the territories had been transformed. New oversight systems were put in place. Federal marshals established permanent posts. Honest men replaced corrupt ones in positions of power. It wasn't perfect. Corruption never fully died, but it was better. Significantly, meaningfully better, and it had started with one woman stepping forward in a dusty street. Refusing to watch an innocent man hang, Nora and Eli stayed in Billings during those 2 months, giving testimony, providing evidence, helping the investigators understand the full scope of what had been happening. They testified at trials, watching as men who'd thought themselves untouchable faced consequences for their crimes. It was exhausting work, dredging up painful memories, reliving the trauma. But it was also healing in its way. Every conviction, every sentence handed down felt like validation. Proof that standing up had mattered. That courage had consequences beyond the courage itself. Through it all, they stayed together. They rented a small house on the edge of Billings, nothing fancy but clean and quiet. A place to rest between court appearances, a place to remember what it felt like to live without constant fear. Eli found work helping a local carpenter, using his hands to build things instead of destroy them. Nora spent her days writing, first just journal entries, working through her feelings, but eventually something larger. A book about what had happened, about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage. Harrison encouraged her, published excerpts in the Gazette. People wrote letters from across the territory, sharing their own stories of standing up to corruption, thanking her for giving them the courage to speak. Deputy Miller returned to Red Hollow after his testimony was complete. He'd been appointed acting sheriff by consensus of the townspeople, a role he accepted with humility and determination. He wrote to them regularly, updating them on how the town was healing, how people who'd been enemies were learning to work together, how the legacy of fear was slowly being replaced by something healthier. "We're building a school," one letter said. Mrs. Henderson donated the land, and the whole town pitched in to construct it. "We want children growing up here to learn about justice and courage, to know that standing up for what's right is possible. We're going to name it after your brother, the Thomas Blake School. Hope that's all right with you." Nora had wept when she read that letter. Wept for Thomas, for the life he didn't get to live. But also wept with gratitude that his death would be remembered, that it would mean something to future generations, that children would grow up in a town where courage was valued and silence was no longer the price of survival. In early spring, 6 months after Kincaid's death, Nora and Eli returned to Red Hollow. They'd been invited back for the school's dedication ceremony, and despite some trepidation, they'd agreed to come. The town had changed in their absence, literally changed. With fresh paint on buildings, new businesses opening, an atmosphere of hope that had been absent before. The townspeople gathered in what was now officially called Blake Square, where Thomas had died and where Nora had been beaten for standing up for truth. But there was no shadow of violence there anymore. Instead, there were children playing, families gathering, people laughing and talking freely without fear. Reverend Michaels presided over the ceremony, dedicating the school and speaking about courage and sacrifice. Then Nora was invited to speak. She stood before the assembled crowd, many of whom had watched her get beaten, had stayed silent when she'd needed help, and felt no anger toward them, only understanding and hope for what they'd all become. "My brother Thomas believed in the goodness of people," she said, her voice carrying across the square. "Even when he saw corruption, even when he knew it was dangerous to speak up, he believed that truth mattered, that justice was possible, that ordinary people could do extraordinary things if they found the courage." She paused, looking at the faces watching her. Pritchard, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Mrs. Henderson smiling with pride. Old Garrett, the blacksmith, young Miller in his sheriff's badge, children she didn't know, sitting on their parents' shoulders. "He was right," she continued. "You proved him right. Every person who finally stood up, who found their voice, who refused to let fear win, you proved that courage is contagious. That change is possible. That one person standing up can become a movement that transforms everything." She looked at Eli, standing at the edge of the crowd, always more comfortable in the shadows. He met her eyes and smiled, a small, genuine smile that made her heart feel full. "So let this school be a reminder," she finished. Not just of Thomas, but of all of us. Of what we can be when we choose courage over fear. When we choose truth over silence. When we choose to stand up even when standing up is hard. The crowd erupted in applause. Children cheered. People embraced. And in that moment, Nora felt the weight she'd been carrying since Thomas's death finally begin to lift. Not disappearing entirely, grief never fully left, but lightening enough that she could breathe, could imagine a future that held more than pain. After the ceremony, as the sun set over the mountains and the celebration continued in the square, Eli took her hand and led her away from the crowd. They walked to the edge of town, to the place where the North Road began its climb into the high country. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about what comes next. For us, and?" Nora's heart beat faster. "I'm done hiding. Done running from life because I'm afraid of losing something. You taught me that. Showed me that the risk of pain is worth it for the chance of something real." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, not carved this time, but store-bought, simple and honest. Inside was a ring, nothing fancy, just a silver band with a small stone that caught the fading light. "I'm not good at pretty words," Eli said, "and I can't promise you an easy life, but I can promise you that I'll stand beside you whatever comes, that I'll choose courage when courage is needed, that I'll never ask you to be silent or small or anything less than exactly who you are." Nora looked at the ring, then at him, this man who'd saved her life, who'd been saved by her courage, who'd become the most important person in her world. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and they stood together as darkness fell over Red Hollow. Behind them, the town celebrated its rebirth. Before them, the mountains rose towards stars just beginning to appear. And between them, in the space where two broken people had found each other and become whole, was the quiet certainty that they'd done something that mattered. They'd stood up when standing up was dangerous. They'd told the truth when truth had a cost. They'd chosen courage over fear, and in doing so had changed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone around them. That was what real heroism looked like. Not dramatic gestures or flawless victories, but ordinary people making hard choices and refusing to look away from injustice. That was what justice looked like. Not perfect or immediate, but persistent and possible. And that was what love looked like. Two people who'd seen the worst in each other and the world, and chosen to build something better together. They walked back to the celebration hand in hand, ready for whatever future awaited them, ready to build a life in a town that had learned, finally, what it meant to stand up for what was right. The stars came out above Red Hollow, bright and clear and full of promise. And in the square where violence had once ruled, children played and families gathered, and hope took root in soil that had known too much suffering. Sometimes it takes just one act of courage to change everything. Nora Blake had learned that truth in blood and pain and hard-won victory, and she would spend the rest of her life helping others learn it too.